what's in your dirt. That you're working in the dirt all the time, and you might come on artifacts. And so he asked me to talk a little bit about what these artifacts mean, how old they are, and so forth. He also asked me to talk about the project that I've been involved in for the last 30-some years down in Morganton, at the site of Asheville, which is a 16th century Native American town, at which the Spanish built a fort in 1567. And that fort constitutes the first European settlement in the interior of the United States. So this is a project that is really significant. We've been working on with a large group of researchers. And so these are two real different topics. I'm going to cover them both really quickly. I'll be glad to answer any questions. Don't hesitate to holler out. I'm going to roll through this pretty quickly. So I'll be glad to answer anything as you go along. And I'm sorry my clicker is not working today. So I've got to go off here. But these are typical pieces of Native American stone tools that you might find anywhere around here, depending on where you're located, where you're gardening. Any one of these pieces would be normal to find. The fact is that these are different kinds of tools made by Native Americans at different times. And Native Americans have been here in our local region for at least 15,000 years. And so archaeologists have a chronology set up that you see right here, with the Paleo Indian period being the earliest inhabitants of the area, followed by Archaic period, Woodland period, Mississippian period, and then what we call the Historic period, which is the period in which we have written documents. Okay? And at that time, as settlers are coming into the southern mountains, you see the Cherokee people who are here, and their ancestors have been here for a long time. So this chronology is well established, and it was actually work at the Warren Wilson College archaeology site that helped establish this back in the 1960s. And it hasn't changed a lot since then. We have a lot more detail about the individual periods, but the general chronology hasn't really changed that much. So I want to show you some of the material that you might find. The evidence for Paleo Indians is really rare. There weren't that many people in the region, but these were hunters and gatherers. They hunted any animals that were here. You hear about Paleo Indians hunting elephants and bison out west. And there may have been mammoths in parts of the east. We have skeletal remains of mammoth as far east as Missouri. But they can certainly utilize any of the animal resources in the region. And the evidence for their presence here is found in points like these. These are the oldest. These go back to about 12 or 13,000 years ago. Those are the oldest that we've found at this point. But we also have pieces like this, found right here in the valley, that are at least 10 to 12,000 years old. So these are small numbers of people. They probably covered a great distance in the course of a yearly round, coming to areas for which they would hunt, gather foods, and so forth. These were hunters and gatherers. The Warren Wilson site doesn't have any evidence of paleo occupation, but for the Archaic and succeeding periods of the Woodland and Mississippian period, there's a lot of evidence on the same site and throughout the valley. We have the same kind of evidence. The Archaic period, we see a huge increase in the numbers of people, the numbers of sites. During the Woodland period, those are still hunters and gatherers. During the Woodland period, we see people living in small villages. They're beginning to, they continue their subsistence base with wild plants and animals, but they're beginning to experiment with domesticated plants. And in the mountains in general, we find evidence for domesticated gourds, for instance. Those are the earliest domesticated plants we have in this area. By the Mississippian period, these people are now full-grown agriculturalists, full-blown. And they live in large settled towns. They're There has been mound building in the mountains since the Woodland period, but the types of mounds that are built are different. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. But Woodland period mounds tend to be typically for burial purposes, whereas the Mississippian mounds are generally, although they did build mortuary facilities, but generally they are built as platform mounds on which to put a temple house or a chief's structure, something like that. And the third image shows a small, what we call Mississippian period village. And I should mention that this term Mississippian comes from a site in Illinois called Chronology. It's located just across the river, across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. So this term refers to people all over the southeast who are agriculturally oriented. They live in organized societies that are structured with chiefs and elites and people who are not elite. These are not the sort of egalitarian tribes that we see in the historic documents on our frontier. And that's a much bigger story. These Mississippian cultures were highly structured and engaged in trade all over the southeast. So the Archaic period, people using the natural resources from the area for food and technological needs, and using small temporary campsites at which they could return over the course of the year. The types of stone tools are varied, but these are among the most common. If you've ever found an archaeological stone tool in this area, it was probably one of these. And you see the time periods that are represented here. The names are names that are applied by archaeologists, and these are similar points that you find all over the eastern U.S. They have different names in different places. But you can see that you have material around here from consistently through these four periods. So the Warren Wilson site, we begin to see a lot of evidence for woodland occupation, little villages that are probably occupied year-round. They are not only harvesting wild plants and wild animals, but they're probably also working with local plants. If they're not domesticated, they're on the way to being domesticated. Things like maygrass, chenopodium and such. These are plants that we consider to be weeds today, but native peoples use those as food resources, and several of these kinds of weedy plants that we know today actually became domesticated during the Woodland period or on into the Mississippian period. And this is just a look at what the Warren Wilson site might have looked like in the 7th century. Just to give you an idea of the technology involved, this is what a woodland house might look like, and we get this kind of evidence from excavating different sites. But this was a building we built down at the Shield Museum in the 1980s, and they're easy to make, but when you have just stone tools to work with, it's a little bit of a challenge. As you can see on the bottom left, cutting down small hemlocks with a stone axe. When you see stone axes, it seems improbable that you could actually use these to cut down trees, but they are very effective. And those little hemlocks, we can cut through those in about a minute and a half. That's all it took with a stone axe. There is a really prominent woodland village here in Morganton County located on the Billmore estate. And some of you may recall news about this project. This was undertaken by archaeologists from Appalachian State, and these next couple of slides are all from them. But this was actually a site that I recorded back in 1982 when I worked with the state on a number of projects. But I was never in a position to undertake an excavation, and so it was great to have the folks from ASU there. And this was a mound site, and it's very hard to see in this slide. But if you're familiar with the entryway, the visitor center is over here on the hill, and this is the main road back to the entry, or the exit road, which is out here. If you look really carefully, there's just a slight rise out here. If you're walking across the field, you barely notice it. It's maybe 1.5 foot, 2 feet higher than the surrounding area. But that turned out, and that was the area that I recorded originally in 1982. It turns out that that was a mound excavated partially by ASU, and it's related to mound structures throughout the southeast and Midwest from the Middle Woodland period. And it's very clear that during this period, Native peoples here in western North Carolina were in constant contact with people from the Ohio Valley. We call it the Hopewell culture. And there was a lot of trading going on, and I'll show you some of the materials. This map right here shows some of the material that was gathered and brought to the woodland sites up here in Ohio and Illinois, including mica from North Carolina. But we have a lot of other material, including copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies, shells from the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast. All of this material is being traded into the Ohio Valley, where extraordinary quantities of exotic objects were being made to be incorporated into the burial mound in Ohio and Illinois. We don't understand all the dynamics of these trade relations, but we know that people from the Ohio Valley were coming here to western North Carolina, interacting with people here, and taking back mica, to big sheets of mica that they would then carve into objects. And down here, we see some of the different kinds of, these are what we call non-local objects. This means these were brought to Buncombe County from outside the area, primarily from Ohio, but there's also material here that suggests some could come from Georgia and Alabama. And what's on this side over here is the local pottery that we find in the same time period. We have a number of these sites in western North Carolina that shows this interaction, and it shows how clearly, for thousands of years, that Native peoples didn't live in simple, isolated groups. They were engaged in widespread trade for thousands of years. We even see this back in the Archaic period. Some of the more interesting materials. This is a pot from Ohio, and it's made. These pieces here, we know were made in Ohio, brought down here not as individual pieces, but as pots. And they could have looked something like this. And that's an image of a bird. Bird imagery during this period was really common, as it is in the later Mississippian period as well. Fascinating artifacts over here. These are pieces of wolf and dogs and bear teeth up here. It's not unusual to find these remains on an archaeological site, but these pieces have been altered by humans. They've been cut and shaped. And these are pieces that people from the Hopewell cultures up in Ohio used to place into the mouth of humans. And we know how they did it. They took teeth out of living people so that they could insert jaws, for instance, from a wolf or a dog. And these would be used for probably, certainly, ritual ceremonies in which there's some kind of transformation going on between humans and animals. And that's the kind of shamanistic perspective, of shamanistic practice. But to find these objects here suggests that this practice was being brought down here and shared with people down here. And this may have been kind of a religious movement of sorts. And it may have been trading religion, in effect, for raw materials in this area. Again, we don't know what the dynamics are for the practices, but it shows this close and really, really intense interaction between these two areas during this time. So, in the Mississippian period, which begins around 1000 AD. This goes to the time of the European invasion. And this is a time when societies are more complex. There are hierarchical organizations socially and politically and economically within tribes all over the Southeast. And the mother town, in the sense of Mississippian culture, not to mean that all the other cultures came from this town. This is the town from which we get the name Mississippian. This is a site called Cahokia, located outside, just across the river from St. Louis. And if you had seen this picture and were asked, where do you think this is from in the world, you might say Mexico. This was a town of at least 10,000 people. It was at its height between 1100 and 1300 AD. That population was never reached anywhere else in North America until Philadelphia in the late 18th century. Okay? When you think about this, this just doesn't fit our idea of Native Americans at all. And this is the rich history of Native America that has been lost in our colonial narratives that are lost and buried for many reasons that I'm sure you're all aware of. Cahokia is a World Heritage Site, just like the Taj Mahal. Most people drive by I can't remember which highway it is. 40. Is it 40? Drive by on 40, and you can see the mounds from the road. I have no idea. There is a World Heritage Site there, sign there, but most people have no idea what it is. And we have Mississippian cultures here in western North Carolina that we give that name to because they're similar to this here. They're a stratified society, they're agriculturally based, and they build mounds, platform mounds, like this here. None of the ones in western North Carolina are anywhere near the size of this, because this mound, this is what it looks like today. It's over 100 feet tall, and it covers 16 acres at the base. So thinking about downtown, what are these 16 acres? From here to the courthouse and beyond in a big square, 100 feet tall. Think of the earthly structure that large. We almost never hear of North American Native peoples living in these kinds of societies. Like I said, there's lots of reasons for that, but it's important for us as archaeologists to help people understand that Native American history is so much richer and complex than most people ever get a chance to learn. I'll go really quickly. This is an image of a mound site here in western North Carolina, where the mound is much smaller, and that even is exaggerated. The biggest mound we have in western North Carolina is probably never more than about 15 feet tall, and that's down in Franklin, south of Quasimail. But showing the agricultural field in the foreground, because these societies were based on agriculture. They're, of course, still harvesting wild plants and wild animals for food, but they were totally agriculture, corn, beans, and squash being the most prominent, but pumpkins, gourds, tobacco, sunflower. And as I mentioned, a lot of plants that we consider to be weeds today were actually domesticated at this time. There's a site in North Carolina called the Town Creek Indian Mound. And this is an example of a Mississippian town where the mound was excavated in the 1930s and 40s, but has been reconstructed into a state historic site. And these images here show the mound with the temple on top. This is an image of what the site would look like at any particular time, although it doesn't show the palisade, which is around the outside of it. And this town would have had a palisade for much of its history. But this is a typical sort of Mississippian site, but it's not typical of Mississippian villages in North Carolina. This was pretty much a mortuary area. Each one of these buildings had multiple individuals buried inside. And although people are buried during the Mississippian period, and even in villages, inside and outside of their home, this settlement, for much of the time, seems to have been particularly focused on burial practices. People weren't really living here. This was a site that was probably used over generations for the purpose of ancestors. I mentioned the Quasimail in Franklin. This is a picture of it from many years ago. Some of you may know about the project in Macon County now, a cooperative project between the county and the, I've forgotten the name of the organization, can't remember, along with the Eastern Band of the Cherokees. And these groups are working together to turn this major Cherokee Center into a heritage site where they can interpret. Right now there's DOT highway marker, and that's about it. But this is a wonderful way for the tribe and local communities to be working together to create a site that will be able to represent Cherokee ancestors much better than they have been in the past. The nearest mound that we know of served as a platform mound to us here was located over in Haywood County, just outside of Canton. And this image shows that. This was a mound that was probably no more than 8 or 10 feet tall, with one building on top. During the earlier Woodland period, there was the structure here had 2 earth modules underneath it. These were buildings that were built into the ground and then covered over with earth. So this had been a ceremonial location for over 500 years. We come to the Warren Wilson site, and this is a small Mississippian village with 15 or 20 houses, as we can see in the photograph here, and the types of pottery that you find in the area look like this. Archaeologists look at the pottery to be able to look at the designs and forms, and we're able to date those to different time periods. We'll look at the excavations, and Warren Wilson is a particularly important site because there are different layers of occupation. These down here are from the middle Archaic down to 5,000 and 6,000 BC, all the way up to the Mississippian levels up here into the 15th century. And this is a map showing the various palisades. There are 5 different palisades running across here, these black dots right here, 2 big palisades out here, and these are the house panels out here. And this is where the posts have been excavated to show the outline of the house. And these buildings would look something like this. This is a building we built at the Cherokee Museum in Cherokee back in the 90s. And this is what it looked like when we were finished. These are typical buildings of the Mississippian period here in western North Carolina.
How many people would?
So in one, this would be a family that was almost definitely 3 generations. Would be the family with children and possibly grandparents. Okay, there could have been as many as 10 or 12 people there. But these houses weren't lived in the way we live in a house. These are used for shelter, for cooking in inclement weather. It's a facility for protection, but living was done in the village. You can do anything out in the village. So the houses they look small to us. It'd be a quarter the size of, an eighth of the size of this room. Okay, it's not a lot of room, but it's just for shelter. And I'm going to quickly move to the berry site. How much time do I have?
If they start wondering, I'll quit.
I'm going to go.
Or nodding off.
I'm going to go real fast. So I'll quickly move to the berry site, which is a little bit later in time. This is a 16th century site where we know that the earliest Europeans into this area, the Spaniards, under Hernando de Soto and in 1540 and Juan Pardo in 1560, 66 came through this area. This is down in Morganton. They were traveling from the coast of South Carolina, and we've been working on this site, and I've been working there since 1986. I want to make clear that these people, their ancestors, the descendants of these people, would be found today most likely among the populations of the Catawba, the Sara, and the Shirah tribes that we know today in North Carolina and South Carolina. So it's not the Cherokee. But this is a map showing the route of Juan Pardo's army from Santa Helena on the South Carolina coast. This is today's Parris Island, where the Marine Corps base is. And this was the capital of what Spain called La Florida, which was North America, basically. St. Augustine had been established, but it was not the capital. This was the capital. And it was a large settlement. But the governor there had a plan to colonize all of La Florida. And he sent Pardo's army to establish a roadway all the way to northern Mexico, over which they could ship gold and silver to the East Coast. And this would be the major roadway connecting all of La Florida. That vision never came to pass because Pardo's mission actually failed. But he was able to establish 6 forts in the interior. 2 in South Carolina, 1 up here, and 1 down on the coast. 3 in North Carolina, 2 in East Tennessee. And the only one that has been identified is at the very site. And that's Fort San Juan at the native town of Chihuahua. So this is where we're located, outside of Morganton, up here about 8 miles from downtown Morganton. This constitutes the first European settlement in the interior of the U.S. We've been doing this project on a major scale since the summer of 2001. I have major colleagues from University of Michigan, Tulane University, and UNC Chapel Hill, with a lot of other consultants from colleges and universities around the country. But this is a public archaeology project. That is, we engage the public in every aspect of the work we do. Not all projects are like that. And since 2001, we've had over 800 students and volunteers take part in the excavations of the site. And if you're interested in having an experience like that, the field school runs during June, and you can find out information from the Warren Wilson site right here, or you can get in touch with me personally. We also have short-term opportunities for weekend projects that we call Dig Days in the spring and in the fall through our Public Archaeology Foundation called the Exploring Chihuahua Foundation. So this is a map and an overview of the site. It's located on a little tributary of the Catawba River, and up in this area up here, this acre, we have identified 5 bird buildings. And those buildings, we believe, constitute what Pardo called the town of Cuenca. They renamed the native town of Chihuahua. They named it Cuenca, which is after Pardo's hometown. And then down here, in this area, in 2013, we finally found the remains of the fort, which was Fort San Juan. And we found a ditch that's marked by these colored lines right here that marks the boundary of the fort. We don't yet know what was on the interior of it. It's a complicated excavation. We haven't had the funds or time to really get into digging. We've exposed parts of the interior, but we don't yet know what's built there. So there's also a mound that's located right here. And this mound was recorded in the 1880s as being 15 feet tall. Today, it's only about 2 feet tall because it was bulldozed sometime in the early 20th century. was because it was hard to plow. And this seems unfortunate, it is unfortunate, but actually around the eastern U.S., thousands, tens of thousands of mounds have been destroyed by plowing and development. I talked about Cahokia in East Tennessee, or in western Illinois. Actually, in St. Louis, there was a site almost as large, with a mound almost as large, and it was destroyed completely, moved, destroyed in the late 19th, early 20th century as the city of St. Louis was developed. There were very few professional archaeologists at that time, and this material was just scattered. We've lost so much of native history that was just ignored. These are examples of the kind of pottery that was found down here during the 16th century. These are from the excavation, and this is a replicated vessel based on this pot broken piece right here. And this vessel is about this big around and that deep. If you've ever made any pottery of any sort, when you see these pieces, you understand how skilled, what an amazing tradition these potters had. These vessels are generally between about 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch thick, and they aren't made on a wheel. Okay. Think about doing that. That is real talent. But this is a tradition that's more than 2,000 years old. We find plenty of evidence of the Spanish soldiers here. Among the most remarkable was this crossbow arrow point right here. To show you that we let the public join in everything we do, this school group, this young woman right here, found us one of the school programs we did where kids come and work at the site. And I've been working there since 1986. I never found one of these. She got reminded. I talked about the structures at the north end of the site. This is what it looks like when we expose them on the ground. This is one structure. Here's another where we've been excavating here. And we've excavated about 80% of this one, about 50% of this one here. But inside the buildings, we are able to look at the layout of the building. We have a lot of artifacts. Most importantly, we have a lot of evidence of the food that they're eating. And what's really clear is that they are being provisioned by native peoples. They're probably getting meats from native men and corn and squash and everything else from native women. And we know that the first part of their stay in the town of Girard was probably fairly peaceful. But ultimately this experiment failed. Something happened such that there was basically a revolt by native peoples. They destroyed all of the 6 forts from South Carolina, not at Santa Helena, but one outside of Santa Helena, all the way to East Tennessee. Probably all at the same time. It was probably a conspiracy. It had been organized, primarily because they were hosting the native, each of these villages were hosting the Spanish soldiers and getting nothing in return. They weren't there to trade with them or to bring them things. They were there to set up this roadway and the defense system. There also very likely could have been some problem between men and women. We know that Pardo had to punish one man in another fort for getting involved with a native woman, a chief's daughter. And the fact is that native women would have been among these men all the time, and certainly things happened. But we only know about all this because one Spanish soldier, there were 30 soldiers stationed here and 125 stationed throughout the 6 forts. In the spring and May of 1568, one soldier made it back to Santa Helena, and he claimed that he had watched, he'd been out away from the fort He had watched the fort get ambushed, all the men were killed, and that he had hidden during the day and traveled during the night to get back to Santa Elena. He said he didn't know anything more about any of the other 6 forts, and the Spanish documents list all of those men as deceased, except for this one guy that made it back. Now, it seems really unlikely that one Spanish soldier could make it back 250 miles through territory that he had crossed at most 3 times. At most, probably just once. And it turns out, we learned from a court document 20 years later, that he was married to a native woman. And it is mostly, and she was from the interior. She wasn't from the coast. And she was probably the reason that he was allowed to leave. And that he was allowed to leave. This could have been an important woman in the town that he was involved with. There just doesn't seem to be any other good reason why this one man escaped. If they wanted to find him, he had to pass through native territory the entire way. There's no way that he did it on his own. So that was the end of the governor's attempt to settle the interior. They even abandoned Santa Elena in early 1585. Does that date sound familiar to anybody? 1585?
Lost colony.
Yeah. That's when Roanoke was established, lost colony. And without a doubt, if the Spanish had been able to hold those forts in the interior and keep their capital, Santa Elena, they would have repulsed the English on the coast. This colonial episode that happened at the very site of these other forts literally changed the history of the Americans. Changed our American history. And it changed world history. That's the significance of this little field out in the middle of nowhere in Burke County. Really quickly, these are what the houses look like. We have a living history village at a park in Morganton where we built these structures here, and we have a lot of school groups out there. This is what it looked like on the interior, and this is just more pictures of that building we made at Cherokee. Really quickly about the fort. We originally found the ditch here. These are the soils that told us what it was. We used ground penetrating radar and resistivity studies to find the rest of it. And we've been following these out. And this is what the ditch looks like. It's about 8 feet deep. And it's a really effective defensive moat. And that's looking across the fort, the interior of the fort. This is the moat. And it's about the size, it's about, say, almost twice the size of this room here. It's not real small, it's not real big, but it's typical of the 16th century Spanish colonies where they would have a domestic compound and a fortified. And this is what we think it looked like when the fort was being built. As I said, we don't yet know what the inside looked like. But we have the houses, the 5 houses just north of the fort. We don't know if the mound existed when the fort was built or whether it was built afterwards. We're not sure about that. We're still working on that. And this experiment represents, a classic colonial episode, contact between different groups. It ended, in this case, with native peoples being in charge. But as we know, that didn't last for long. I'll finish with, again, a reminder that you can work at the very site through our field school or through the Exploring Jara Foundation, and we'd love to have you. I appreciate your patience. If we have any time, I can answer a few questions.
Since this is a garden club, how do plants figure into archaeology, into dating, into understanding the culture, what food stuff they're using?
So plants are essential to our studies in terms of looking at food and nutrition, not just that simple aspect of what they eat, but looking at how plants are used in feasting, ceremonial context, also for medicine. We have folks who specialize in the study of plants. We call them archaeobotanists. And we have 3 different archaeobotanists working on this project. One deals with the plant foods, one deals with the river cane, and one deals with all the wood. So we spend a lot of time with that. And also, more organic materials like plant foods and wood especially can be used for radio processing. Anybody else have another question?
Thank you, Dave.
Really